Okay, this Tanakh study event was sponsored by Rachel Towell in memory of her grandmother, Miriam Bat Leah Aleha Shalom. Remind everyone that this coming Saturday night, we will have Rabbi Liebtag to address us on any topic. Talk a little bit tonight about the story of Elisha with the Isha Shunamite. Okay. We want to also welcome Raymond Towell to our class. I said, it's been a while since you've been sitting in my class. Baruch haba, Raymond. No steaks tonight? No. Okay. So I said, I want to talk tonight about the Isha Shunamite, the episode with the Isha Shunamite. But before I do so, I want to have a little bit of an introduction to Elisha, because that's going to be important a little bit to understand what happens with the story of the Isha Shunamite. Now, Elisha, as we've seen in the last few perakim, really is a sort of a interesting miracle worker, right? He performs large miracles with big discussions. He performs maybe, smaller miracles could be said, or certainly smaller incidents. We've seen national miracles, and we've seen personal ones. In this, he stands out even against his teacher Eliyahu. Eliyahu Navi is really a national navi. It's true, he has and sometimes performs personal miracles in different situations, but we'll see that really has a national backdrop to it. But as I compare him to Elisha in a minute, but with Elisha, there's simple personal miracles. In Hasidic lore, Elisha is usually the justification of the Rabbi, right, who performs miracles right and left, and they always look to Elisha. You'll find in a lot of Hasidic literature that is because, and I think the reason is that you find just in Perek Dalet, you'll find the Almana, you'll find the Isha Shunamit, you find the seed, you find the bread. We have later, we'll talk about the axe. You'll see the blind, you'll see, of course, Naaman. You'll see the blindness of the soldiers. But even as you find him, even as an introduction to that story, you find Elisha telling the king about all of the plots of Melech Aram. So there's not a chapter in Elisha's life where there's not miracles being performed. And like I said, he flips back and forth between the national miracles, the prophecies against Moab, right, and to the personal ones, back to the national ones, and we see back and forth an interesting interaction. And I think that's one way where we'll contrast Eliyahu versus Elisha. As I mentioned, Elisha performs miracles just for people, just to take care of people. Right? Elisha, as we'll see, is also a very popular navi. So I'll just give you a few examples of that popularity. Of course, the Isha Shunamit herself, the fact that Vayhi Hayom Vayavod Elisha Shunem B'Sham Isha Gdola V'Tahazek Bo Lechol Lechem. Right? An important person brings him and is ready to support him. Now, where does Shigo in 4:23, Perek Dal Pasuk Kaf Gimel. Vayomer Madua et holechet elav lachodesh v'lo Shabbat v'tomer shalom. Right? Why are you going? It must be we see obviously on Rosh Chodesh, on Shabbat, he had people, entourages approaching him. Okay? And of course, when she comes to Har HaKarmel, vayikiroti shelotim itna vayomer Gehazi naro inei Shunamite Woman. In Pasuk Lamed Het, ואלישע שב הגלגל ורעב בארץ ובני הנביאים יושבים לפניו. The בני הנביאים are sitting in front of him. In He Gimel, ותאמר, no, not He Gimel, I'm sorry. That's just the Navi in Shomron. Yeah, and of course in Vav Lamed Bet, ואלישע יושב בביתו, this is when the king is coming, והזקנים יושבים איתו, וישלח איש מלפניו בטרם יבוא המלאך אליו. והוא אומר לזקנים, הראיתם כי שלח בן המרצח הזה להסיר תושי. In other words, Elisha is always around people. We find him traveling, we find him different areas. He's clearly a navi, a popular navi. Kings have to deal with him. He's a force. We see Elisha rebuking kings. We see kings, the same kings that want to kill him, call him Avi, in deference and respect. And we see him instructing them how to behave. So Elisha is a very popular Navi. Eliyahu, of course, lived a more secluded life, right? And if anything, the two incidents that are similar, the two Almanah incidents were Eliyahu and Elisha. If you go to Melachim Aleph, Yud Zayin, right, way back to Eliyahu's feeding of the Almanah, you'll find the incidents there very different than this feeding of the Almanah that we read here as an introduction to the Shunamite story, in that in Eliyahu's incident, it really has Eliyahu feeding this poor woman has the backdrop of Eliyahu himself being fed. Right? In other words, he is requested to feed the Navi. And whereas in Elisha's incident, it's purely and simply to perform an act of hesed for a poor woman and her orphan child. So we find their different approaches, and we do find Elisha being part of the people, as we've seen, concerned about the people, just for the people's sake, and willing to perform a massive amount of successive miracles. And many of them are simply to benefit the people, of concerns of the people. And I didn't even mention all of them. There's not the Bnei Nevi'im. There's not a place for them to live. There's just miracle after miracle after miracle. And they don't always have a larger national connotation. They don't always have even a message. It's simply a hesed for the people. Now, with that in mind, and with understanding Elisha in that context, I think that's an important context, now we'll move to our story, to the story of the Isha Shunamite. The Isha Shunamite, as I mentioned, is one of the more important stories of Elisha, and I would say you have these larger stories, whereas suppose we have these small miracles. The Isha Shunamite becomes the first larger story, where there's a really a large plot here. Of course, you have, of course, later we'll see the Naaman story, and of course we'll see the Shomron story. All of these are larger plots, larger discussions of how Elisha behaves. So in the Isha Shunamite story, we right away notice a difference, and I don't think this difference is accidental, between the story that preceded it. The story that preceded it was what? Was a story of an almanah who had nothing but a child. And that child was in danger of being taken. And in fact, of course, as the backdrop, that also shows us the pathetic nature of Am Yisrael's inn, because it's a Jewish creditor that's going to take that child. So this is a story of a woman who has nothing but her child. The story of the Isha Shunamite is a lady who has everything but a child. So it's the literally opposite scenario here. You have, well, she has a child, she has everything, but she doesn't have a child. And so that becomes the Isha Shunamite. I want to make a comparison here, and I'm not going to draw any conclusions for that comparison right now. I want you to keep it in mind, and I'll get back to it. So this story, the Isha Shunamite, let's see, does anyone know what parasha this serves as a haftarah for? Yeah, just think. Come on. Even if you don't know it, think about it. Just think what it's similar to. Take a guess. You got to get it right. Vayera. Right? Parasha Besorat Sarah. When Sarah is given. So, what are the similarities? Similarities are obvious. One, they're preceded by Haknasat. What? Good. Let's go before. That's the Ka'ed Hayat. It's true. You're giving a year, and then you're gonna have a child. That's very important. Let's even go way before that. Before the child's born. First, it begins with what? With Haknasat Orhaim. Right? There's a beautiful display of Haknasat Orhaim on the part of a barren couple. There's an akara and a husband. And the husband is called old. Right? He's an old man. He's identified as an old man by somebody. The woman's an akara, and they perform together Haknasat Orhaim. Like you said, in 1 year they're going to have a son. That's the thing. And in both, the women react skeptically. Right? In both scenarios, the women are skeptical. And in both scenarios, the child is born only to later be placed in grave danger for his life. In the story of Yitzhak, it's Akedat Yitzhak, and in the story of our story, obviously the child dies. Now, the similarities are important. What I need you to keep in mind is because we're going to see who are the messengers in the first story, in the Abraham story. They're malachim, they're angels. So the fact that it's Elisha acting here, we see Elisha clearly acting as a representative of Borei Olam. I think that's a crucial point that we gain from creating these similarities. But we will see very important differences. So I need you to keep these similarities in mind, as very often what do we say? When the two stories are similar, and they have so many similarities, sometimes it's to accentuate one or two important differences. And in those, and through the differences, do we learn something about the protagonists in each story? So let's keep that in mind when we approach the story of the Isha Shunamite. So we have that Sarah Imenu story, the birth of Yitzhak story, as a backdrop for this story. Now, in the story itself, there are two important people and two basically what we'll call peripheral people, right? Not including the son. So the two main people in the story are whom? Are obviously the Isha Shunamite herself and obviously Elisha. The two peripheral people, we'll call them, but they do have a role, as we'll talk, the Shunamite's husband and Gehazi. The son is simply an object. He has absolutely no role here at all, right? He's just to be born, die, and reborn again. Okay? So, in the two important people, the Isha Shunamite and Elisha, we do find something interesting happening to both of them. There's a certain change that happens throughout within the story. The Isha Shunamite begins. Well, what is she like? Let's talk about what is she like. Give me some words that come to mind when you see her at the beginning of the story.
Hospitable.
Well, she's hospitable, good. She's a bit humble. She's not interested. She wants to get close to the navi, but not for her own personal gain. She refuses her own personal gain. She lives amongst her people. She doesn't stand out at all. She's somewhat passive. And is she in charge of the home? So there, we'll read you this pasuk, and we'll see that she certainly is not. Because when she wants to build the aliyat kid, what happens? What does she do? She asks her husband. ותאמר אלישע, הננה ידעתי, כי אישה אלוהים קדוש הוא עובד לפניו תמיד. נעשה נא עליית קיר קטנה ונשים לו מיטה ושולחן וכיסא ומנורה, ויעבור אלינו יסור שמה. Right? She obviously gets her husband's permission to do that. After the story, or at the end of the story, she's forceful. She takes clear charge. She doesn't even tell her own husband that the son is dead. She's in charge. And the husband asks, "Why are you going?" And she just does her thing. And she even speaks harshly to the navi. Is this the child? Did I ask for a child? There seems to be some metamorphosis in her. And Elisha, almost we'll see, also has a change. But it's a little bit of an opposite change. Elisha begins very confident, right? He comes in, well, what can I do for you? You want to go to the king, you want a general. And eventually, at Gehazi's prodding, he promises her a child. Now, there's something also important about Elisha's miracles, which I should have said in the beginning. Who's not involved in Elisha's miracles? Who's really not, doesn't seem to be part of the story, or not performing the miracles? Right. It was Kadosh Baruch Hu is not God, please. No, just okay, I'll do this. And so he says, okay, yeah, you'll have a son next year. And confident it comes true, it's successful. But by the end of the story, we find him almost failing. And he accentuates those failures. For example, he doesn't know that the son died. And he says that. God didn't tell me. His first attempt to revive the child is met with failure. And this is Eliyahu's student, right? Eliyahu doesn't fail, right? And all of a sudden, Elisha doesn't work. That's a transformation a little bit within Elisha. He has to go a second time. He prays to God. God enters into the scene a little bit. Praise to Hashem. So we have to look at this and just keep that in mind. With that in mind, we'll now begin to approach the perakim. And we have some questions, right? We have some obvious problems within the story, right? Can anyone think of some problems in the story? Well, every time we meet an akara, in all of Tanakh, what's the first thing we're told about that woman? That she's an akara, right? Right. The text introduces the woman as somebody who hasn't had a child, right? Wherever you go back to, Sarah, Rivka, even Rahel, Hannah, the Isha Shunamite is clearly an akara, but we're not told anything about that. Elisha doesn't even know she's an akara. That's the next question. Why doesn't Elisha haven't noticed that? He doesn't even know that she's an akara. And the Shunamite doesn't ask for a child. Like, you have a navi. It's the obvious thing. What can I do for you? Nothing. I don't really need anything. I got everything. I'm fine. But she has no child. what does that mean? The obvious question, right, the biggest question, what we'll call the elephant in the room is, well, why does the son die? Right? Is a son given to a woman in reward for her hospitality by the chief navi, and the son dies? That is also a little bit of a, we call that a failure of Elisha in a certain sense. Why should the son die? And again, why doesn't Elisha know what happened? He's a navi. He gave the woman a child. How come God keeps him clueless about what happens? And of course, why does his first attempt to revive the child fail? So we have a lot of questions here. We have a lot of questions that seem to make this perakim somewhat problematic. So there are a few themes to think about as we approach this perakim. And we'll find in it there's a certain aspect of growth and teshuvah. Maybe teshuvah is the wrong word, but certainly growth experiences. So let's go and let's talk a little bit first about the Isha Shunamite. As I mentioned, she doesn't seem to be bothered that she's an akara. Every akara in the text, right? Sarah begs Abraham. She says, take my servant. She has a solution. Rivka, they're praying. Yitzhak, right? And Rivka are praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rachel, right? She screams to Yaakov. Right? You got to give me a child. Hannah, of course, she does is cry and beg and pray. So she doesn't seem to be bothered by her scenario of being an akara, right? In other words, as I mentioned, she doesn't mention it. She seems to be okay with it, and that's okay. Sometimes made peace with life as the akara. So much so, right, that when she gets the message, her response of disbelief, again, very different, certainly different than Rivka, certainly different than Hannah. When Eli tells Hannah, she's in full acceptance, in full belief. Now, you might say, as I mentioned, that it's somewhat like Sarah, but not fully. Remember, Sarah doesn't know she's talking to a malach. Right? Sarah doesn't publicly flaunt her disbelief. It's personal. Sarah b'kirba. Right? When she's confronted, she absolutely denies her disbelief. The Shunamite openly looks at the Navi, right? Straight out and says, come on. Right? And V'tomer al Adoni Ishalim al tahazev b'shivchatecha. Don't lie to your handmaiden. Now, it's important to understand, this doesn't seem to be, from the context of the pasuk, a lack of belief in the ability of the Navi. Meaning, don't make fun of me. B'shivchatecha. It seems to be, she seems to have a lack of belief in herself on some level. In other words, she's saying, you're ridiculing me. There's no way I could do that. Okay? If you look at the context of that, it doesn't seem saying that she's questioning the ability of the Navi. She seems to be resigned to a life of an akara. This is her lot, and she's okay with it. Right? Now, this acceptance of the life of an akara continues throughout the story. Because what happens if we move a little bit further into the story? The nivuah comes true. Now, let's go back to all the akarot. What happens when they have a child? You find some point where we're told about their upbringing, right? Their reaction. First, actually, before their upbringing, the mother's reaction. Sarah, what does she do? She makes a song, right? A praise to Borei Olam. Okay? Right? She actually creates the... ותאמר ששחוק עשה לי אלוהים, כל השומע ישחק לי, ותאמר מי מילא לאברהם, העניקה בנים שרה, כי ילדתי בן לזקוניו. Right? And then, so there's a praise, right? Rahel, by calling him Yosef, she's praising God and she's praying for another child, right? We know Hannah's reaction. She praises God. The whole song of Tfilat Hanav. What happens here? Just nothing. Now, the second bizarre reaction is that we're not usually in Akara, when the child is born, some special mission is preserved for this child, right? So, by Yitzhak, if we go back to Yitzhak, and of course, the concern is to remove Yishmael from his midst. We find some aspect of chinuch of the child, the education of the child becomes a predominant concern, especially to the mother. That's certainly about Sarah. Again, we don't have to repeat that about Hannah. It's obvious, right? Even Eshet Manoah, the Akara, right? Shimshon, right? He grows up, Vayigdal, Vayvarcheu Hashem, right? Here, what happens to this young boy? What special chinuch does he get? So let's take a look. Vayigdal hayeled, vayhi hayom, vayetzel aviv el hakotzerim. Vayom aviv roshi roshi. Take him to his mother. Nobody seems to be paying attention to this kid. He doesn't seem to be educated in any specific way. He just goes out to the field. His father's working. He's got a headache. Oh, take him to his mother. Somewhat of a neglected child on some level, but certainly not something unique, not seen as this special gift of Borei Olam that needs to be preserved, that needs to be educated, that needs to be taken care of, needs to be involved on some level of unique mission, so to speak. And I said, even Eshet Manoah, even Shimshon seems to get this better upbringing. This is Isha Shunamite. This is what we're seeing. And all of a sudden, the pivotal turning point for her is what? The child dies. Now the child dies, everything turns around for her. Her whole world is in an uproar. All of a sudden, that child that she didn't want, the child that she neglected after he was born, right? She now understands immediately what she's going to do. She right away sees the value of that child that she just lost. Very often, that's what happened, right? We don't know the value of something until we lose it. That seems to be what's happening to the Isha Shunamit. And right away, she knows what she's going to do. Vatal vatishkeva mitati sheloim. Vatikra Elisha v'tom shilhana li ahad me'ane'arim. And I'm going to go to the Isha Elohim and I'm going to shuva. Right? She right away. So we see this. All of a sudden, this Isha Shunamit starts to learn that the value of the gift that the Navi has given her, the value of that child, she beforehand doesn't seem to be so interested for whatever reason. And the text doesn't really tell us a reason. We can guess that maybe part of a defense mechanism for this akara is, oh, I don't really want one anyway, right? But nevertheless, this is what happens, and there's this pivotal moment of change that seems to be represented in the story. Elisha is unique here. And as I mentioned, and I purposely mentioned that Elisha is the most caring of all Nevi'im, right? He cares about his people. But what happens here with the Isha Shunamite is unique. Because right away from the beginning, first thing is he what? He doesn't even know what she needs. So, in Pasuk Yud Bet, we see already that he doesn't even address the Isha Shunamite. ויאמר לגחזי נערו קרא לשונמית הזאת ויקרא לה ותעמוד לפניו. Call her. ויאמר אמור נא אליה. You, Gehazi, ask her what she needs. And of course, she says, I don't need anything. Right? When you go to Tetvav, and he says, they have the idea to give her a child, again, Gehazi is to call her. And, right? He doesn't even answer this, by the way. He doesn't answer her. Okay? Now, if when we go to Perek Kafhe, Pasuk Kafhe, ותלך ותבוא אל איש אלוהים אל הר הכרמל, ויקרא אות איש אלוהים מנגד, ויאמר אל גחזי נערו, הנה השלומית עלז. She's coming. התרוץ נא לקראתה, ויאמר לה שלום. Right. He sends Gehazi. Still sending Gehazi. Right? And then, in Kafhet, she says, she right away doesn't really, she just ignores Gehazi. She's not interested in talking to Gehazi. And Gehazi is literally going to push her off. And we would assume that he assumed that that's what Elisha would want. And then she says, still, she refuses to talk to Gehazi. She comes to him. He doesn't even go. And go back and do this miracle. And she then says, then he finally goes and and Gehazi gets there faster, does the failed miracle, and then Elisha. So what happens here to Elisha? He seems to be totally ignoring this woman. Right? He's not the one who asks if she wants the child. He's not the one who ever has discussions with her. Right? He brings this child in, doesn't even consider her. Now, what's the point there? So some of the Mefarshim, the Al-Sheikh HaKadosh, points this out, and he says, you know what? It's the inner tzniut of Elisha to talk to a woman. It might be true. But on some level, the text seems to actually be making Elisha responsible. In other words, there seems to be some form of transformative experience here for Elisha himself. The ultimate caring navi for all the people somehow, and we'll see why, and we'll try and figure out why, seems to be very distantly removed. Everything is through his servant. He barely talks to her. He doesn't really get involved even in the welfare of the child. And what happens to Elisha? So Elisha now, it's almost a midah keneged midah. It's an almost midah keneged midah in a sense, you're that distance, you're that removed, you're not going to know anything. Meaning, I, God, am not going to tell you what's going on. And that makes an impact on Elisha because he himself says it. Right? Right? And it says, right away, he sees that there's something wrong. God doesn't tell me. And like I said, it's almost a midah keneged midah. God doesn't tell you because you're not really interested. And so, there's this point. He doesn't know. He still doesn't get it. He sends Gehazi. It doesn't work. The navi is telling us Elisha needs to assume responsibility for the welfare of this child personally. And of course, what happens towards the end of the story? That transformation as well occurs to Elisha. And he, of course, then goes, he literally becomes one with the child, and he brings the child back to life. Okay. That becomes some form of a transformation in Elisha. But we really need to figure out why Elisha would be that way. Why would what happened that Elisha is so removed from this situation, which we haven't seen that before? So I think to answer that question, we need to see another transformation that happens within Elisha. As I mentioned before, Elisha's miracles are his own. And this miracle would probably be the most daring. The actual, we'll call this a double miracle, the actual promising a child on his own, and then of course, promising to revive the dead on his own. But, we have a famous Gemara, right? There are 3 keys that were not given to human beings, only were given to to God. One of them, of course, is Tahiyat HaMetim. In a certain sense, Elisha is taking a lot of responsibility or a lot of power on his own, but immediately promising the Shunamite child. Now, I want you to let's go back now to the Sarah story and look at that and see. I showed you the similarities, but let's take a look now and see a stark difference. So we're going to go to Bereshit, Kaf Aleph, Pasuk Bet. Anyone want to read it? I'll read it. Vatar vateled Sarah Abraham ben Lizkonav lamoed asher diber oto Elohim. Now, I'm going to read now Perek Daled, Pasuk Yud Zayin. Vatar Isha vateled ben lamoed hazeh ka'et haya asher diber eleha. I should say Hashem here. It's Elisha. Right? This is Elisha's miracle. We'd like to have Borei Olam involved a little bit. No. Elisha literally jumps to the promise and literally makes his own promise of a miracle. Now, I said before that I criticized the Isha Shunamite right away for not believing, but now let me look at it from a different perspective. It's very possible that the Isha Shunamite herself says, "What? You're promising me a baby? How could you do that? She's shocked. This is Borei Olam's. What are you talking about? Who gave you the right to promise me a child? Right? It's very possible that it comes from that perspective. She can't believe it. And maybe she's right not to believe it. When did we ever see, without the promise of Borei Olam, a person promising somebody else you're going to have a child? It's a shock. In fact, maybe, if we take a look, maybe that's part of the reason why, yes, God cannot, so to speak, quote unquote, cannot not fulfill the prophecy of Elisha, because of course, what does that do? That undermines the word of his prophet. So he has the child, but the child dies. So what message does the prophet get? Wait a second. Okay, I gave you, it came true. You never said that the child will live, but in a sense, what does that do to the navi? That undermines his whole gift. Or maybe it tells him it's not yours to give to begin with. And then of course, that also puts in perspective some of Elisha's failures, right? His failure to know that there's the welfare of the child, and his failure to actually bring the child back to life. And then what happens? What happens at the end? How does he actually bring the child back to life? So the pasuk is very clear. For the first time in the perakim, he does something. What does he do? He talks to Borei Olam. Right? Look at the end. Vayavo, vayiskor adelet bat shneim, vayitpalel Adonai. He got the message. It's not his cloak, it's not his mission, it's not anything that's going to work here. There's no miracle magic. His mishanet is not going to bring this kid back to life. He's going to take responsibility, on the one hand, as before, where he was removed, a bit aloof, a bit removed, saying the miracle worker, probably thought he could do it through Gehazi. Probably thought he could perform these miracles. But at the end, at the final scene, when all fails, he turns and prays and begs the Borei Olam to bring the child back. So who finally brings the child back? God. Now, okay, so I asked the question, how did he get so removed? I answered it by saying he may have gotten so removed because he was performing, or believed he was performing, miracles and didn't have connection with Borei Olam. But now, so really what I do, I answered a question and I replaced it with a bigger question. Because how does that happen? How does one of the greatest Nebi'im start performing miracles without involving a Kadosh Baruch Hu, seemingly? How does that point happen? How do we get to that? So I'll answer with one word, and we'll go through. And that one word is Gehazi. And we're going to bring Gehazi now back into the story. We see Elisha. I said he's a popular navi. He has Bnei Nevi'im around him. He has a whole cluster of people following wherever he goes. He has kings coming to him for salvation. He's a very popular navi, powerful navi, and develops around him an entourage of people. And he has secretaries, right? There's the old joke, right? When the rabbi gets a secretary, that's already the biggest problem. He has that, the assistant, so to speak. So Gehazi becomes the assistant to the navi. And they always ruin the story. because Gehazi seems to be somewhat enamored with his master. Right? He's like the Hasid of Elisha. To the point, is it Elisha's idea to give this woman a child? Let's go back. Whose idea is it? Elisha innocently says, can I do anything for you? Do you want me to speak to the king on your behalf? I have connections, right? I have certain connections. I'll do something for you. You know, life in Israel, you always need connections. I will talk to someone. Maybe you want the Tzar Sava. Maybe you need some protection here. Maybe you want some military protection, or maybe you need the king. I'll talk to the zoning board. I don't know. I'll talk to whatever you need. You have any connection? She says, no, I'm fine. I don't deal with that. I am like anybody else. I don't want any special treatment. That's a very fair request and a fair response. He wants to do her a favor. Elisha is an important person. He has connections with all the right and important people. And he says, listen, you're going out of your way for me. You built me this. Let me repay the favor. He's not offering him in a very natural way. But what happens? It's Gehazi who says, what are you talking about? What do you mean? You don't know what to do, right? So now Elisha goes to Gehazi. What should I do for her? What do you mean? Give her a kid. So Elisha says, okay, tell her I'll give her a kid. You see, Gehazi is the beginning of this. Right? Gehazi is the assistant to the miracle worker. Gehazi sort of benefits from this. He becomes the semi-important guy. Right? As we know, when she comes to Har Carmel, right? It is Gehazi that approaches her. Elisha, I'll take care of this. And of course, she dismisses him immediately as an irrelevant person. Right? And then, of course, when he says, listen, go and take care of it, of course, Gehazi's certainly volunteering, oh yeah, I'll do the Tahiyat HaMetim, give me the mission, yeah, I can do it, right? And encouraging and assuming the power of his master. So much so that there's an interesting midrash. The midrash says that when Gehazi is on the way, now remember, Elisha told him, go straight, don't talk to anyone, don't have any conversations, don't speak to anyone. But when Gehazi is on the way there, what does the midrash say? The midrash says, they ask him, where are you going? He says, oh, I'm going to be Mehayeh Metim. So the people tell him, this is a conversation it's not supposed to have. People tell him, I can be Mehayeh Metim. Only God could be Mehayeh Metim. So Gehazi chuckles and he says, my master Elisha could be Mehayeh Metim. So it becomes, at least Hazal certainly see within the Gehazi the beginning of this approach, so to speak. Now remember, this is the first time where we see a Gehazi active, this story, right? And all of a sudden, he's this person. By the way, there's another midrash, which may contradict this, which seems to have him say, yeah, I'm going to be Mehayeh Metim, chuckle, like almost ridiculing it. Right? A lack of belief. But nevertheless, we'll take the approach now that Hazal is seeing that there's this Gehazi's, we'll call it overbelief in his master. That he believes, so to speak, that his master seems to have a power on his own to be Mehayeh Metim. And as Elisha seems to be entrusting more and more to Gehazi, that's where the problems, so to speak, start to come in. That's where not just does the Shunamite need a message, but Elisha himself needs a message. He needs to remember, right, that he has to take responsibility for this child. He needs to remember that it is through Borei Olam and through only Borei Olam that he will perform miracles, and that he is a navi, not an institution. He is a navi, not someone who needs to delegate to a whole bunch of other managerial duties, and we have Gehazi handling the situation. Because once that happens, once the delegation to Gehazi comes in, we've got problems. I think that's a key part of this message, and I think the Gehazi element is really a key component of part of the problem of why things don't work, and what the point that Elisha has to still learn. Now, the problem with this story or this approach is that at the end, okay, he wakes up. Now what does Elisha do? What should he do? He's got to tell his wife. He's got to tell Elisha Shunamite. So, what do we expect now? He learned, got it, right? Now what should he do? Well, I'll tell you what he does. He calls Gehazi and says, oh, by the way, tell the Shunamite that her kids are left. Oh my gosh, what happened here? Gehazi, we're not done with him just yet. Really, we're not finished with Gehazi yet, right? But as we know, and with this, I'll take a few minutes just to trace Gehazi a little bit. Because we already know what happens to Gehazi. We know how Gehazi falls, right? Gehazi seems to rise up the ranks by using the power of the navi, right? He rises up the ranks by being Elisha's assistant, so to speak. This is who he is, right? And he sort of manipulates that power to his benefit. Okay. In fact, it's quoted, he's just to show you an example, Gehazi speaking to the king and telling him all things that Elisha has done, right? He's almost the guy who's like the person who spends all the time with the navi or the rabbi, right, the assistant, and then writes a book about it, right? In other words, he's the one who likes to sort of benefit himself off of his master. So he comes up through the power of the navi, encourages the navi to take unusual steps where it's inappropriate, and the navi himself learns through that point, and then we see something happen. Now let's take a look about Gehazi as we go through in later chapters. Really, the fall of Gehazi happens in another story, which I'm really not going to spend a whole lot of time on at all, but just to point to the Gehazi point. We know the story of Naaman, right? Naaman has sarat, and he's cured from his sarat. How is Naaman cured from the sarat? Naaman is not cured from sarat. There's a lot to talk about in that story, but just to summarize it in a minute. How is he cured from the sarat? He's cured from the sarat by undergoing a transformation, right? He doesn't just get cured from the sarat. Naaman comes and he leaves a different person, and through that different person, he becomes cured from the sarat. Naaman has to grow. There's no magical concoctions here. In fact, Naaman is upset about that initially. Naaman comes, right, under the philosophy of Aram, and he says, okay, cure me. Now, who does Naaman goes to his king, who goes to Melech Israel, who's going to go to Elisha. So we think that's ridiculous, right? Because if Naaman has sarat, and Elisha, as we're told by this simple Na'ara, who simply says the simple truth, Elisha can cure the sarat. So we'd expect Naaman to go over So, okay, I'll go to ask Elisha. No, instead of doing that, we got to do it the hard way. We got to go to Aram, Melech Aram, who goes to Melech Israel, who go to Eli. Why? Simple. Because the Aram philosophy is the navi is a dependent of the king, as we see all the Nabi Sheket in the time of Izebel. They do what the king says. They have no independent opposing force, as in Yisrael, where the navi is a check and balance to the power of the king. So, now the king knows he can't cure him from Sarat, so he's stuck. Why doesn't he go to Elisha? Good question. But he knows he can't command Elisha to do anything. So Elisha tells him, I'll take it, right? Now, so he comes, and so Naaman comes with his philosophy. He's Mr. Arrogant. He wasn't even approach the Elisha. And of course, Elisha's not going to approach him back. He thinks the king will control the navi. The navi, and really, by extension, the God, is there literally to serve him. Right? And that's how we begin. And of course, what is he doing? He's bringing payment. When you bring payment, that's a service. So someone is going to do this for me. I don't have to do anything. I'm coming to you. I want you to handle my tzarat, get it done with, some magical incantation, and I go home. The divine powers are there to serve me. And to encourage you to serve me, I will pay you well. He's shocked when he's told, dip in the Yarden. He's shocked, right? Dip in the Yarden. What does that mean? And meaning I have to do something? If I want to go wash, there's plenty of beautiful rivers in Aram. I don't understand. But he changes. Again, an unknown person advises him. He dips, and all of a sudden, a transformation occurs. He becomes submissive. He calls the navi his master. He decides he wants to worship Hashem. Even at the end, right? What does he want to give the navi? Not payment, so to speak, but what does he want to give him? He wants to say a beracha, meaning a gift, meaning I can't give you. I just want to give you a gift from your servant. Meaning there's a transformation in Naaman. Now we can argue whether that transformation is total or not, and that's again for shiur on that pedic. We can have that discussion. But what I want to show is that there is some form of a transformation that occurs in Naaman. And Naaman goes through step A, which makes him arrogant and he's in charge and everything is for him, to someone who is submissive, right? Whether he's fully or not, Hazal argued, was it right that he said, I'm going to worship or not? Is it pikuach nefesh? Is it not? That's another thing, because the Navi doesn't tell us, lech l'shalom, and it ends. What happens to Gehazi here? Gehazi, right? What does he do? So he lies. He's this deceptive crook. And he goes and he lies to Naaman. Now, Naaman at this point is very vulnerable, right? He's on this spiritual high, right? He'll do anything Elisha asks from him. And Gehazi understands it, and it's perfect manipulation. So, right? It's the assistant to the Navi who manipulates the beauty and the authority and the power of the Navi to get what he wants, right? Just imagine, right? The rabbi, the holy rabbi, you have the people around the rabbi using the Gdulah and the holiness of the rabbi for their own needs, right? That's Gehazi, right? Right? Gehazi belongs in jail, right? In a sense, that's really what's happening here. And Gehazi, who's really thinking that Borei Olam is to serve man and that he will benefit from the abuse of power, who does he sound like? God, it's all about me. God's there to serve me. The Navi is there for me. what does that sound like? Who does he sound like? He sounds like Naaman sounded like about 10 minutes ago. So in a very fitting way, when Elisha looks at his student and says, that's what you are, fine. That's what you want, that's what you got. Because really you are Naaman before the change. So therefore, take his sarat too. The sarat is almost automatic. That sarat that was on Naaman is on to you because you are really what Naaman was. And in a sense, the rejection and the repudiation of Gehazi is Elisha's absolute recognition that this is an illegitimate servant. And that becomes almost the fall and the end of Gehazi. There's an interesting, so that's sort of the epilogue, and then there's an interesting epilogue to the epilogue, right? What happens, right, after that, right? After that story of Naaman, the Nevi'im come, and they say, Vayomru bnei ha-Nevi'im el Elisha, hinena makom asher anachnu yoshvim shem lefanecha tzad mimenu. We don't have enough room to live, right? Now, we already know that these bnei Nevi'im seem to live in what? Abject poverty. Well, how do we know they live in abject poverty? Because even when an axe falls, and it's a borrowed axe, they're like crying. Right? There's abject, they're hungry, there's situations where the food doesn't work, the pot, all these miracles. So now we see that there's Yoshvim Sham, Tzad Mimenu, let's go to Yarden, and we'll make a place for us to live. Yeah. Right? So, and they'll have more space, very nice. And they have, and that's how then the barzel falls, and he saves the barzel. Now, the Radak says something interesting. Well, the Radak asks a question. Why do they need a new place now? Why do they need a new place to live? Why all of a sudden are they crowded? And what does that have to do with the story before it? Right? What does that have to do with the story? You know what the answer is? Simple. There's nobody standing by the door of the rabbi inspecting who gets in and who doesn't. There's no one, the corrupt assistant who needs to be bought to get into Elisha, he's gone. That corrupt guy at the door, he's just thrown he's out of job. So now what happens? A lot of people come out of the woodwork. Elisha gets a lot more students. The Bnei Nevi'im, says the Radak, there are a lot more of them now. Because Elisha himself becomes much more accessible. There's no one pushing people away like he pushed Elisha Shunamite. There's no one sort of trying to take charge of the office of the rabbi. That guy's gone. Says the Radak, since he's gone, what happens? A lot of people come now. And there's a lot of students, and there's no place to live. So they got to find a larger place to live. So, in a sense, if we think about this, what happened here is the story of the Isha Shunamite represents a transformative experience upon the people. It represents some of the greatest miracles in Tanakh, which is the birth and Tahiyat HaMitim. And it represents a transformation for the Isha Shunamite herself. It represents a transformation for Elisha on many different, multiple levels, on different facets. Level 1, he also needs to interact with the Isha Shunamite. Can't be removed. Level 2, he also needs to remind himself that he must resort to God to perform these miracles. On both levels, the source of the problem is the corrupt assistant that he empowers. And that corrupt assistant, that Gehazi, who is really empowered by the navi, has those negative effects. So what happens is both of those scenarios within Elisha are transformed within the case of the Isha Shunamite on a level of him interacting for her directly, where he walks, he follows, he handles the situation. And on a level where he comes back to interacting with Borei Olam to perform the miracles and a direct involvement of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That happens at the end of the story of the Isha Shunamite. The one thing left out, the one thing that doesn't really happen at the end of that story, and we need another perek, is the eradication of the source of the problem. Gehazi is still there. The next episode, the episode of Naaman, is what will fully, so to speak, force Gehazi to show his true colors, and the source of that ultimate problem will be removed. And according to Radak, once that problem is removed, the Navi's own popularity doesn't diminish, right? When you don't have that manager, it's the opposite. A tremendously popular Navi with a lot of students becomes more popular and has more students, so much so that there's no place for them to live because they have to go to Yarden to it. So that really becomes sort of that transformation that's represented within this story of the simple story of Isha Shunamite, which looks on the surface as Tahiyat HaMetim, but there's a lot to it. That's why the child dies. That's why the child's brought back. That's why Elisha's efforts need to be, they fail in the beginning and they succeed only at the end.